All right, everyone. Well, welcome to Pacific Science Center's first ever virtual planetarium show. We wish you could come and see us in our Willard Smith Planetarium, but we're trying to make the most of it. But we're hoping that you enjoy our very own virtual show from the comfort of your own home. Here today we have two of our educators, myself. My name is Max.
And me, my name is Marissa. Hello, I'm so excited to talk to you all. Now, Max is going to be sharing his screen using, what program are you using, Max?
It is called Stellarium, and you can kind of see that in the top left corner of where my screen is.
Fantastic. So he will be sharing his screen to show you this nighttime sky, and I will be keeping track of everyone's comments. So at Pacific Science Center, we usually tell our audiences not to raise your hand if you have a question because it's really dark and we can't see you. We tell people to shout out their answers. Now, right now, with all of us at home, we definitely can't see you. So if you have a question, please shout it out by commenting on the side of the YouTube screen.
Mm-hmm. All right.
All right.
Shall we begin?
Let's go.
All right. So where we are right now is located in Seattle. And right now it's the current time of our live broadcasting, which is just past 1 p.m. Now, as you look, you might be able to see some things. It looks like I see the moon, Venus just barely up there. But I'm going to focus kind of over to the west. Now, I want to look over to the west because if I speed up the time, we'll be able to see that sun set. And as daylight goes to nighttime, the sun is going to drop beneath that horizon and we'll be able to see some other things pop up in the sky instead. Now, I stopped it just about 20 minutes before 10 p.m. So hopefully a good time for everyone to still go outside and hopefully find some of the things that we'll be talking about today. Hopefully you will be able to kind of listen this afternoon and be able to spot them tonight. Now, I don't know about you, Marissa. I often like to talk about maybe the most popular constellation, a constellation known as the Big Dipper.
That is one of my favorites.
Now, the Big Dipper is a group of 7 different stars. 4 of those stars are kind of making it look like a cup, and 3 of those stars are in the handle. So I am able to see them. It's pretty high up on the screen right now, pretty high up in the sky tonight. And it's right here. 1, 2, 3 in the handle. And then you've got 4, 5, 6, 7 in the cup. And we call that the Big Dipper. Kind of looks like a big spoon almost. But Marissa, you know about another dipper that's in our sky.
Yeah, that's right. We do have 2 dippers. I also want to add the Big Dipper is part of a larger constellation called Ursa Major, the Big Bear. And if you add a few more stars to it, you might start to see that bear. Max, do you want to point out oh, you can bring it up. Fantastic. I think you got a typo right there, my friend.
Oops.
Excellent. There you go. You're starting to see the bear now, folks. So you can see it's got its legs coming down. It's got its bare face, its bare ears. You might notice something kind of funny back towards the rear there. It's got a big, long, fluffy tail. I don't know about any of you folks, but I have never met a bear with a big, long, fluffy tail before. This is something kind of unusual about the bears in the nighttime sky. Both of them, Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, which we'll get into in just a moment, have big, long, fluffy tails. And there's a lot of stories to explain why those bears have big, long, fluffy tails. Max, do you have a story you want to tell?
I do. It's kind of a short story, but it's a story that a group of people here in North America would often tell. because the bear long ago had arguably the biggest and most beautiful tail in all the forest. And the trickster animal, the fox, very, very, very sly. He wanted to play a trick on the bear. So the fox convinced bear that it could use its tail as a fishing hook. Marissa, do you think a tail would be a good fishing hook?
If you're really creative, probably.
Probably, yeah. So the bear wanted to give it a shot. Now, this was towards the beginning of winter. So bear set its tail into the water, into the lake. It kind of carved out a little hole in the ice, and it just continued to wait and wait and wait. There's even a snowstorm that came and kind of, so when Fox checked in on the bear the next day, there was just a big bundle of snow. The bear had fallen asleep. And so the fox, being very tricky, snuck up to the bear and it yelled, "Wake up, bear!" And the bear woke up, jumped up because it was so startled, snapped its tail right off. Now, that's why I like to think the bears like to hibernate during the winter. Kind of forget about the long tail they used to have.
That's a tough lesson.
Yeah.
Awesome. So the other cool thing about Ursa Major, about the Big Dipper, is that you can use it to find a lot of other groups of stars. So earlier we briefly mentioned the Little Dipper, and you can use the Big Dipper to find the Little Dipper using two stars on sort of the end of the spoon part. There they are right there. Their names are Merrick and Doobie. I'm not kidding. These stars are named Merrick and Doobie, which is kind of funny, I think. So Merrick and Doobie are called the pointer stars because they always point to a very special star in the nighttime sky, a star that we can use to find directions and a star we can use to find the Little Dipper. So if you take those pointer stars and you count about five of the spaces in between them kind of straight down at this point. Next, can you do that if you count about five of those spaces down?
2, 3, 4, 5.
Fantastic. You find a very special star called the North Star, or Polaris, if you want the fancy name. So as our planet turns and moves through space, we face different parts of space at different times of the day and at night. And because of that, the stars appear to move around us. But because the very tip of our planet, the North Pole, is at a tilt, it is tilted and pointed straight at the North Star. So no matter how much our planet moves around, the tip of our planet is always facing the same way. Because of that, Polaris doesn't seem to move. So you can always use that to find the directions. Polaris is also the very tip of the tail of the Little Dipper. So if you ever want to find the Little Dipper, use those pointer stars, count down, and you find the tip of its tail. Max, do you want to bring up the Little Dipper?
I will, but I just want to I like to talk about things and then I'll show them. So I'm going to kind of fast forward us into tonight and then kind of bring us back to the time we are at right now. And as we watch that, you can see a lot of stars moving, but the North Star is staying in the exact same spot. Everything else is kind of moving around kind of that specific star. But we said that it was part of the constellation Ursa Minor.
The little bear.
And Marissa, I noticed that this bear also has a long tail, just like the big bear.
It sure does. I get a lot of guests telling me it looks more like a squirrel, which I can definitely see.
Yeah. Or even maybe that's the fox.
Yeah, could be. Definitely could be. I know the Greeks say the bears were picked up by the tail and swung around a couple times and then thrown in the sky, and they say that stretched their tails out.
Maybe.
Maybe so.
Now, before we move on to the next thing, I think, Marissa, you were going to show us some things to find using the Big Dipper. That Little Dipper and that Big Dipper are always very noticeable in our sky. I always like to point out that if you find the Big Dipper, you can kind of see it right there. You really are just looking at the Big Bear's butt. So.
Thanks for that, Max. Awesome. So I said earlier we can use the Big Dipper to find a lot of different constellations. You can find the Little Dipper as we just saw. At this time of year in spring, you can find a couple of other pretty prominent stars and their constellations. One of them, the name is actually up right now. It's called Arcturus. And I can always find Arcturus, in the real nighttime sky. There's not a nice fancy name up there for us to read it by. So the way I always find is I go back to that Big Dipper. So if you look back at the Big Dipper, remember it's got the 4 stars that make up the spoon and it's got the 3 that make up the handle. If you go to that handle and you sort of draw an arc from that handle all the way straight down. Yeah, thanks, Max. I'm pointing at it, but you can't see my pointing in your screens. You can arc to Arcturus. Draw a nice arc from there all the way over. And once you found Arcturus, you found a larger constellation. Max, do you want to talk about the larger constellation?
Of course. So this kind of has a funny name. I've heard people call it boots. Some people have told me booties. But I'm probably mispronouncing it. I believe the Greek pronunciation is Boötes. And there are some different stories related to like who Boötes might have been. Possibly the person who invented the first plow to help a lot with farming and being able to kind of cultivate their own food. One story I often like to share, it's kind of a funny one, is that one of the Greek gods, Dionysus, he showed Boötes this magical elixir known as wine. And Boötes was so excited that he wanted to go show all of his friends. And they were having a good time. And then the next day, they all didn't feel the best. They had a kind of a splitting headache, and they thought that Boötes had poisoned them with this magical elixir. So they kind of ran him out of town, but I always like to think Boötes is kind of the constellation to have the first hangover.
Those poor friends. I have a story I like to tell about this as well. My story isn't about the whole constellation. It's just about that one star, Arcturus, the one we arced to. It actually comes from the Pacific Northwest, from the Lummi tribe, who are indigenous to here. And they say that star right there isn't named Arcturus. They see it as something else. And this story involves a character called Coyote, who shows up in a lot of Native American stories. He's often a trickster character. In this story, though, it has to do with a special skill he has, sort of a party trick. What he does is he goes to parties and he pops out his eyeballs and he juggles them. This is his party trick. He juggles his eyeballs. By the way the story goes is one day he was at a party, he popped out his eyeballs to do his trick, and he threw one too high up in the sky, and it got stuck up there. And that star that, yep, that star that the Greeks called Arcturus, the Lummi tribe called Coyote's eyeball. Kind of another goofy one.
Sure is.
Awesome. So once we arc to Arcturus, there's another constellation we can find. Yeah, awesome. Max is drawing us that line right there. You arc to Arcturus, but if you keep going straight in a line from Arcturus to the next sort of bright star, there it is. That star is called Spica. So the full saying is you arc to Arcturus and you speed on to Spica. And Spica is part of another larger constellation. Max, take it away.
Now, this is the constellation known as Virgo. And oddly enough, it's a very big constellation. I believe it's the second largest that we're able to see in the Northern Hemisphere. But besides Spica, it's a pretty dim constellation. So this was a pretty noticeable star. And many people across the northern hemisphere would use that star to know kind of when spring was here. So when they were able to see it, maybe this time of year, they would use it to know to start planting. So just like Arcturus kind of represented a plowman, Virgo and Spica represented kind of when to begin growing their own food for the summer and into the fall wind harvest.
Yeah, so if any folks are sitting at home thinking maybe this is the year you start up a garden, Spike up there is telling you time to get those crops in the ground.
That's true, that's true. I have read some stories, kind of Virgo's the daughter of Boötes, but I'd have to look more into that. I'm not sure if you've heard anything related to that, Marissa.
She tends to be associated with a lot of different harvest goddesses. I know Persephone is one of them, the goddess Persephone, who spends half of her time up on land, half of the time in the underworld. They sort of use that story to tell the changing of the seasons. When she shows up, it's time to plant. I've also heard her associated with, oh gosh, what is that name? It was like the goddess of justice. It starts with a D.
DK.
DK? Yeah, and that was kind of a funny story. Apparently, back a long time ago, when humanity was great, DK would go around like dispensing justice, I guess. She was the justice goddess. But over time, I guess people got a little more unruly and she got mad at them. So she went up in the sky and she just sits up there looking down and judging all of us. She doesn't actually pass judgment. She's just looking down on us and thinking we could do better. All right, DK.
Yep. We're all just trying our best.
That's true. That's so true. Awesome. So we found a lot of different stars in this section of the sky. Do you think it might be time to move on to another section?
I think so. Now, something I want to kind of point out is we mentioned the North Star, Polaris, that's in the direction over to the north. And right now, towards the beginning of the spring, those constellations, those stars we just mentioned, Arcturus and Spica, those are going to be over to the east.
We
So
also
now,
have a question.
Oh, perfect.
Sorry to jump in there.
No,
There's a
me
question
too.
about who created the constellations. From Maria. And if Virgo is so dim, why did they choose those stars? Which is a great question. I can talk about it a little bit. Something really interesting is that across the world, from as far as we know, basically every group of humans throughout time that we know of across the world had stories about the stars. We don't know exactly why. I know some ideas is that, a long time ago, the night was a pretty scary place. It was dark. It was full of unknown beasts. So if you could look up in the sky and see something familiar, see some familiar pictures and stories up there, it might make the night a little bit less scary. And then the reason why some of these constellations are so dim, that's a great question. Max, do you want to talk a little bit about nighttime lights and why some of those constellations might be harder to see now?
Yeah, with just kind of modern advancements and with kind of us having a lot more lights on, larger populations, especially with cities, there's something called light pollution. So the lights we have on Earth kind of block out the stars that we're able to see up in the nighttime sky. So what might be very, very dim to us now was maybe not so dim 2,000 plus years ago.
Awesome. Also, sorry.
Nope, go ahead, Marissa.
Thanks, Max. Rebecca asked if we can show Sagittarius. I can never remember when Sagittarius is up, which is terrible because that's supposed to be my birth sign. Is it up at this time of year?
So unfortunately at the moment, no. So Virgo is kind of one of those first spring signs. Sagittarius is more of a summer. So it will be coming up later this year just in a couple of months. And that's kind of a good transition to what I just pulled up. This red line we're able to see is known as the ecliptic line. So this is the path that the sun travels during different parts of the year. Now, if we move to, let's say, late July, and now I type in Sagittarius, if I can type it. There it is, and it looks like it's going to be right next to Jupiter and Saturn. So hopefully it will be pretty easy to spot.
Right on.
Was July 28th.
Awesome. Thanks, Max. And thank you, folks, for sending in your questions. So I think we were just about to look at another part of the sky.
Yes. So just like Marissa mentioned, this time of year, you can use the Big Dipper to find a lot of different things. So if we look up at our Big Dipper earlier, we used these two stars to point all the way to the North Star and the Little Dipper. We arced to Arcturus, we sped up to Spica. Now we're going to kind of look over to the south, but we are still going to use that Big Dipper. So I'm going to use the pointer stars that we used to find the North Star, but we are going to look in the opposite direction. And so here's that Big Dipper. And if we look at that Big Dipper and we point all the way down, we're kind of looking at this trapezoid. And so if you look tonight, just to kind of, this always helps me out. I always try and look in the direction of Mount Rainier if I'm living in Seattle. If I look in the direction of Mount Rainier, I know that's towards the south, and I might be able to see this thing. And it's kind of a big trapezoid, but then there's this like backwards question mark. Are you able to see that, Marissa?
Yeah.
Does that remind you of anything?
I mean, yes, because I know the constellation, but if I didn't know the constellation, I don't think I would be able to recognize what that's supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. Let's see.
Clearly a lion, right?
Yeah, people have told me a mouse. A mouse is a common one.
I can see that.
I think I've heard the Loch Ness Monster.
That's good.
Yeah. Now Leo, just like Virgo, kind of goes along that ecliptic line. But Leo often is related to the story of a Greek Roman hero that many of you might be familiar with, known as Hercules. Now, Hercules, unfortunately, was asked to do 12 impossible tasks. And those tasks were thought to be impossible, but Hercules was a pretty well-gifted guy. And I always like to point out many of them involved fighting different animals. My favorite one is he had to clean out a big barn full of poop. Now, Leo, or the Nemean lion, was the first task he had to do. And the Nemean lion was a tricky animal because its fur was impenetrable, so it couldn't be stabbed. Now, Hercules and Leo had a big battle, kind of a big wrestling match, but Hercules was able to complete that impossible task. And he, as the story goes, he saw the value of that fur, so he, for the future tasks, chose to wear the lion's coat as his own little cloak.
Very fancy.
Mm-hmm. Now, something I often like to point out, we kind of have been mentioning some other groups of people, not just Greco-Roman constellations and stories. If you look and find that backwards question mark, you can kind of see it right there. This is a really well-known star. It's called Regulus. If we have any Harry Potter fans, Regulus was the brother of Sirius Black. And you can kind of see Sirius just underneath the horizon down here.
Yeah, you'll start to notice a lot of Harry Potter names up in the stars.
Yeah, exactly. But what a group close to the Great Lakes in the Midwest did was they connected that backwards question mark to like this group of stars right here. And they called it the Great Panther with the Curly Tail. And just how some people would look at Arcturus or Spica and know that it was time to start planting their crops. This group would look at that constellation and they would know to not step on frozen lakes, because if that was up, spring was soon on its way. And it would mean that there was a high chance that you would fall into the frozen lake and possibly not survive.
Good to know. We've got a few more questions, Max. One person, I believe this is Rebecca again, asked, what time of the year does Gemini come up? And I believe Gemini is up right now.
Yeah. Marissa, would you like to kind of talk about Gemini?
Yeah. So Gemini is the twins. Oh gosh, let me see if I can remember the story. It's two brothers. I know they hatched out of an egg, according to the ancient Greeks. One of the brothers, their names were Castor and Pollux. One of the brothers was immortal and the other brother was mortal. So one of the brothers was going to live forever and the other was going to live a natural human life. And this is the part where I always start to forget the story a little bit. I also can never remember which brother is which. Is it Castor?
Unfortunately, I know a good rhyme to kind of keep track of them. Castor dies faster.
Oh no!
Castor is immortal.
Oh, poor Castor. Excellent. So, Castor ends up, I believe, reaching the end of his life and dying. And Pollux is so sad about it that he begs and pleads the gods to put the brothers together somehow. So Zeus says, okay, here's a solution. I'll split your immortal life between the two of you. So one of you is alive for 6 months of the year, the other is alive for the other 6 months of the year. But you get to live forever like that. And they did this for a while, but the problem was these brothers wanted to hang out. They were best friends. That's why they wanted to live forever, so they could hang together forever. But they were alive at opposite ends of the year, so they never got to see each other. So the second solution was to stick them up in the sky. And something I've noticed with the ancient Greeks is the solution to many problems seems to be sticking people up into the sky. Heroes are put in the sky, villains are punished by being put in the sky, everyone ends up in the sky. Thanks, Zeus.
Yeah.
We've got a few other questions.
But before we move on to the next one, Marissa, I just want to point out that, so this is tonight still. It looks like Gemini is the two brightest stars, Castor and Pollux, are going to be right above the moon.
Perfect.
And that's going to be over to the west.
So if the clouds clear up, look for the moon, I guess, to find Gemini. So MD asked, has there been any time Polaris hasn't been in line with the North Pole? That is a great question. Max, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. There has been. And I always kind of phrase it like this. So the Earth likes to move in 3 different ways. It rotates. Every rotation, we have a day. Every orbit, we have a year. The last one moves much, much slower, and it takes much, much longer. And it kind of almost rotates kind of like a top. I don't know if I'm able to pull it up. But there's something called the precession circle. And so as that Earth kind of moves around like a top, in 2,000 years, we will have a different star as our North Star. It won't be Polaris. Polaris will be somewhere else up in the sky. Um, and so you can look, and I haven't looked a ton into it. I don't know if you have, Marissa, but some groups thousands of years ago would use a different star as that North Star than we currently use today.
I feel like I read for a while it might have been Vega, which is a fairly bright star, which would be pretty nice. I used to think the North Star was the brightest star in the sky, but it's actually the 49th brightest, so it can be a little bit hard to spot sometimes. Vega would be a lot more helpful.
Yeah, but kind of with that being said, you can kind of see the distance that it might, the North Star or true north might move is, here's the North Star Polaris right here, and Vega is way over here.
That's quite a wobble our planet has.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a request to see Scorpio and Taurus. I believe Scorpio is a summer constellation, but Taurus might still be up.
Yeah, I'll do Taurus. That's a little bit easier to pull up first, and then I'll move on to Scorpio for Scorpios. So Taurus is more of a winter constellation, so it's easiest to see during the winter up in the sky. And I'm gonna back us up a little bit. Then I'm going to cheat a little bit. So I'm going to turn off our atmosphere. And so you can see the 3 stars in the belt of Orion right here. And those point to this kind of bright orange star, but this, I always like to point out this V pattern. And if you're able to see that, that's kind of the head of Taurus, that V. And so unfortunately, you're just able to see Taurus. You're able to spot Venus. You might be able to see the tips of the horns. But it's right at sunset at the moment. Or you might be able to see it over by the horizon tonight.
This is actually a great spot to be in because there were a couple questions about this part of the sky. Someone was asking about Venus earlier, and there it is right there.
Yeah.
And this is about 10 p.m. Yeah.
Yep. It says about 9:40.
9:40. Awesome.
Yep.
There's also a question about that star with kind of the funny looking name beside Venus. That one right there. Why is it called that?
So that's an interesting one. I believe it translates to armpit of the giant.
I love this star.
Yeah, that's getting more popularity as we kind of hear more or observe it more and more. But that's the armpit star of Orion the Hunter. I've always heard it pronounced Beetlejuice, so I always kind of warn people, just be sure you don't say it 3 times. And then often a disclaimer, a little generational gap there.
I heard that supposedly the people who made the movie heard the name of the star Beetlejuice, thought it was a great name, and it inspired the name of the movie. I don't know if this is true. This is just a legend I heard.
Yeah, we'll have to hear from Hollywood about that
one. Right. We also have a lot of requests about the Milky Way.
For this system, I'm not able to see the Milky Way super well. But one thing I often try and do, I don't know if you have anything to kind of add on, Marissa. I'm going to speed up back up to summer. Oh, and there you can kind of see it.
There we go. There it is.
So here's the Milky Way. It's going to be over to the south this summer. And I always kind of like to point out Sagittarius again. So here's kind of the arm of Sagittarius. But I always see a tea kettle. So here's kind of the kettle itself, and here's the spout.
Yeah, that looks exactly like a tea kettle.
Now, if you pretend to pour out the tea kettle, Sagittarius, to about right here, you're roughly looking at the center of the Milky Way galaxy. So what people call our galactic center.
That is so cool.
And kind of going back to light pollution, unfortunately, that's one of those things we aren't able to see super well with kind of our current night sky. If you live close to or in a city, is the Milky Way is often one of the first things that kind of get blocked out by that light pollution. Do we have any other questions before we move on?
Yeah, we had a question about the Pleiades. Can we see the Pleiades still? If we've got Taurus up, seems like it should be. The question was, will you talk about the Pleiades and the other names for them?
Yeah.
Oh, there they are.
Yep. So this is kind of tricky because I turned off the landscape. I'm not sure if you're all able to see it at the bottom.
You cheated.
Yep. So this is something I often forget, is that what you're looking towards can impact what you might be able to see. So if you are in Seattle, you're going to see more looking towards the west because you're looking towards the Pacific Ocean, rather than looking towards the east where you're looking at the Cascades. Those Cascades will kind of be higher up, blocking what you might see if they weren't there.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, we can kind of touch on the Pleiades. The name Pleiades, or it refers to seven sisters. And I always like to ask people, how many stars are in this, what we call a star cluster? Many different people saw 7, 6. I think it was the ancient Celts saw 4.
Yeah. So the Grelocken?
Yeah.
Is that's the name? Yeah. The 4 lakes.
Mm-hmm. But as we zoom into this star cluster, certainly more than just 4, 5, 6, 7.
I think the ancient Mayans said it was like 10,000 boys or something. 1,000 boys.
Yeah, I've heard of that. I'd have to look more into it for that specific story. One of the other names I know about it comes from Japan. And they call the Pleiades Subaru. And so if you're familiar with that car company, especially that car company logo, this is where they got that idea from.
I have a story I really like to tell about the Pleiades.
Okay.
This comes from the Western Mono people who are indigenous they're from the South California region. And they also say that's a group of 7 women. But in this story, it's a group of 7 wives. And the way the story goes is these wives live in a village with their husbands. And every day the wives go out gathering food, gathering plants and stuff to eat. The husbands go out hunting for food. And the wives are all best friends. So one day the wives are all out gathering food, and one of them finds this new plant that she's never had before. And so she brings all her friends over and they look at it and they all taste a bite of it, and it tastes really, really good. So they're like, ooh, we need to gather more of this plant. So they get a whole bunch and they eat it, and it's delicious. But that day when they come home to their homes, their husbands come up to them, they sniff, and they go, what have you been eating? That is the worst smell I've ever smelled. I don't know what you ate today, but you need to stop eating it. And the wives all go, all right, fine. We promise we'll not eat that anymore. But the next day they go out And again, one of them finds this plant and it tastes so good. She just can't stop herself. So she calls all her friends over. They all eat it. It's delicious. That day they come home and again, their husbands go, "Oh, you smell awful. You need to stop eating that. If you keep eating that plant, we are going to leave you and never come back." And the wives go, all right, fine. We promise we won't do it. So on the third day, they go out and they tell themselves, I'm not going to eat this plant. If I see this plant, I'm just going to walk right on by it. But of course, they find the plant and it tastes so good. They can't stop themselves. So they eat it and they know their husband said that they couldn't do it anymore. So they come up with a plan. They gather as much of the plant as they can. They go out to a sacred place outside their village and they start dancing. And as they start dancing, they start rising up into the sky. And the husbands come running out and they go, no, 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 never mind. We promise, don't leave us. We weren't telling the truth. Like, you can eat that plant if you want. And the wives go, too bad. And they dance themselves up in the sky where they can eat as many wild onions as they want. And there they are right up there partying.
Right there. I feel like I've heard that story, and let's see if I'm able to pull it up. I've heard that the head of Taurus right there is, so these are the wives, these are the husbands.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. So they're trying to catch up, but they can never quite do it.
Yeah. That's a funny story. I like that one.
I like it a lot. Awesome. So we have a few more questions. I'm gonna check where we're at on time as well. I think we're doing okay. Let's see. We have some questions about what planets are up tonight. And there's Venus again right there.
Mm-hmm.
Are any other planets up tonight?
Yes and no. So Venus is going to be very, very noticeable over to the west, kind of in roughly the same direction as the moon you can see right there. 90% of the time I think Venus is a plane until I notice it isn't moving. That's how bright it is. So Venus is noticeable kind of at dusk. For the other planets, I'm going to kind of pivot us from looking over to the west to looking over to the southeast. And I'm going to kind of speed us up into dawn. And let's see what planets we might be able to see then. And so if you look kind of tonight, well, I guess tomorrow morning, you're up around 5 a.m. You might be able to see Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter right before kind of that sun pops up over to the east. So at the moment, Venus is the only one we're able to see at night. Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter are all going to be visible in the early morning.
Someone asked, Max, what's your favorite constellation?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. Part of me says the Big Dipper, Ursa Major, just because it's super noticeable. You can use it to find a lot of things. Marissa, are you familiar with Canis Minor?
Yes, I like Canis Minor.
Yeah. So great timing too. So I've got Procyon. Not sure if I'm saying that one correctly. This is a star in Canis Minor. It kind of connects to that armpit star of Orion, down to the brightest star in the northern hemisphere. At night, we're able to see Sirius, and you kind of connect it all the way up to what some people call the summer triangle, or excuse me, the winter triangle.
And remind me, what is Canis Minor supposed to be a picture of?
Well, see, that's the tricky thing because it translates to the lesser dog, the little dog. Canis Major is the big dog. As you can see, it's just a line.
It's
So
just a line.
I always like to call it kind of the hot dog constellation. It's still a dog. It's just kind of long and skinny, the hot dog.
That's a good name for it.
Mm-hmm. Marissa, do you have a favorite constellation?
Oh, honestly, I like Orion a lot. It is very noticeable in the wintertime. There's a lot of good stories about it. Yeah. There it is right there. It's always easy to find, even in the middle of Seattle with all of those nighttime lights up. If it's the right time of year, you can look up and you can see Orion. I like the constellations that I can find and point out to people easily.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
There was actually a question about what advice do you have for seeing stars and planets if you live in a big city? The good news is there are still stars that you can see. There are still planets. You can see Venus. I have seen Venus and Mars from Pacific Science Center at night, right up there. So there are nice and bright ones. Something I also like to say is if you find one star, if there is a constellation that there's just one bright star that's part of it, like say Spica, Virgo is pretty hard to see, but you can see Spica. If you found Spica, you found Virgo. You don't have to see all of the stars in it to say you've seen that constellation. You just have to see the bright one.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I kind of think the same way with the North Star. The rest of the Little Dipper is kind of hard to see.
Yeah, but if you found the North Star, you found Ursa Minor.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Do we have any questions before we kind of focus on a couple of our final things?
Yeah, let's see. There were some questions about meteors, possibly meteors happening tonight.
I would have to look more into it. I feel like the most recent meteor shower I heard about is the Lyriids. And often meteor showers are kind of named after what constellation to look towards. So where you might try and look, and I'd have to look on the date. So I'm not sure when this meteor shower was or is, but I did see like some headline referencing towards the constellation of Lyra.
Awesome.
Which is, let's see, how might you find Lyra? So there's the Big Dipper up there. Guess look past the Little Dipper, or use these stars to point all the way down.
It's about northeast.
Mm-hmm.
Right on. I realized I have another answer to the question about favorite constellation. Max, have you heard of Coma Berenices?
I'm familiar with it. The name. I don't know a ton about the actual constellation.
Well, the name of it is basically Bernices Hair. And I think it is hilarious. There's a story about this. And the story is that this queen's husband was off at war and she was really worried about him. So she prayed to the gods and said, if you send my husband back safely, I will give you my beautiful long hair. And her hair was like the glory of the whole kingdom. She has the best hair. So her husband comes back safely. So she chops off all of her hair. And he's very upset about this because he was also a really big fan of her hair. And he goes to the astronomer and like the person who speaks to the gods, and he's super upset about it. And the astronomer is like, oh, well, actually, if you look up in the sky right there, there's our hair right there. The gods liked it so much, they put it right up in the sky. See? And the king was happy with that, and he left everyone alone. There's her hair.
Yeah.
Some quick thinking on the part of that astronomer.
Yeah. Well, and so often when people ask why constellations look like blank, in the planetarium, I always kind of say, we're not here to make up the rules. We just have to enforce them.
True that. Great. We're probably reaching towards wrapping up time. I do know there are a lot of requests for the Zodiac Signs. If there's a way to sort of run through all of them real quick or bring them all up and show them.
Yeah, so I don't know if I'm able to do that with this, just to pull up the Zodiac sign. So I'm going to kind of cheat and pull up all of the constellations.
Cool.
And you'll kind of be able to see that along that red line, we've got kind of Gemini over to the right side of the screen, Cancer, Leo, Virgo. Then you kind of go into more of the summer constellations, which is going to be Libra. You see Scorpius and Sagittarius we kind of touched on earlier. Into Capricornus, Capricorn, which I always think is funny. It's the sea goat. You mentioned you were a Sagittarius, Marissa. I'm an Aquarius.
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
And then you've got Pisces, the fish. The sun is right next to Aries, the ram. And then as we kind of fast forward all the way, almost 24 hours now, you can kind of see Taurus to the left of the sun. And then we were back to Gemini, Cancer, Leo, and Virgo.
This is a great reminder that even when the sun's out, the stars are still there. We just can't see them because our own star is too close.
That's true. Oops, wrong buttons.
All right, awesome.
One final thing I will kind of touch on is that I always think the moon is such a cool thing to look at. And using it, you're able to kind of tell when it's going to be full or not. I grew up with the phrase, when the moon is on the right, it's going to get bright.
Oh, I haven't heard that one.
So as we kind of zoom into the moon right now, you can see it on the right side right there. So over the next week and a half, this moon will just continue to get brighter and brighter until the full moon of May will be May 7th. And then kind of the opposite happens, but I haven't figured out a good rhyme for the opposite.
And I believe the next full moon is called the flower moon, right?
Correct.
That's fun.
Yep. Each month has a name for a moon. So April was the pink moon. May will be the flower moon.
Right on.
Well, do we have any final questions before we wrap things up, Marissa?
Let me check real quick. How does the moon turn pink? Oh, that is a great question. That brings up why all these names for the moon are a little bit silly. Yeah, there are a lot of interesting moons. I think at one point earlier this year, we had like the blood wolf moon or something.
Yeah.
And that just has to do with, correct me if I'm wrong here, Max, but I believe that just has to do with the time of year that it's in. There's just different names for each full moon over the course of a year. So as awesome as blood wolf moon sounds, it doesn't really look any different. It's a full moon.
and it's kind of tricky because there's some things like pink moon is the moon of April. So that's just the full or a full moon in the month of April. Blood moon often relates to a lunar eclipse.
True.
So I always kind of say it's like you're seeing a sunset on the moon, which is why it might turn kind of red. And then another weird thing that doesn't really change the color of the moon is called a blue moon. So you may have heard of once in a blue moon. That just means there are 2 full moons in a calendar month.
Which doesn't happen super often.
That's right. But I looked it up for this year, 2020. We're kind of lucky, that we will have a blue moon on arguably the spookiest day of the year, Halloween.
Ooh, exciting. Well, fantastic. I think it might be time to start wrapping stuff up. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah. I hope this was helpful. I hope it kind of encourages you to not only go out and look up at the stars tonight, this week, this month, later this year, or to use programs like this or on your phone to, if you're curious about what that star or what that planet might be, to use something to figure it out yourself.
Awesome. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any last minute questions, feel free to add them to the chat. I think PacSci will be able to answer a few of those questions once this video ends. Excellent. Stay curious, everyone.
Yep. See you later.
Bye.